How's your New Year's resolution going? Are you still on track? Are you kind of falling off? Um, some of the research is showing that within a month, most people's New Year's resolutions have already gone by the wayside. Some places are saying as low as 50%, and some are saying as high as 80% at the end of the month. Their New Year's resolutions are completely done with. How am I doing, you ask? I found the secret to making New Year's resolutions, and I discovered this when I was in grade 3. Actually, I discovered the secret to making a New Year's resolution that you can keep, and I have followed through with that ever since, and I'm going to share that secret with you. In grade 3, I was very, very tired of being asked what my New Year's resolution was every year, and it didn't really matter to me, and I was just always having to do it for schoolwork and whatever, and so I decided in grade 3 I was going to make a commitment to never make another New Year's resolution again. And 23 years later, I am still going strong. I think I have beat the statistics here. But maybe for some of you, you've made a commitment to keep a cleaner home. This is one of those New Year's resolutions that tends to be a little bit common among people. And I know that when Gab and I were in our small apartment, what keeping a clean home meant. What it meant was we would tidy everything up, and anything that we couldn't find a place for, we'd throw it in the closet, and we'd just pretend that it wasn't there. But unfortunately, our apartment had very few closets, and the closets that we did have were very small. And so eventually these closets got very full, and it looked kind of like what you would see in like the cartoons where the door is like bulging open and ready to explode. In fact, at one point, our closet door fell off its hinges because it was packed so full. See, there was something in the way that we had decided to clean our apartment, something in the way that we had decided to go about doing that we had missed. And often what this resulted in was our apartment would just end up getting cluttered and messy again. And so there was something that we were missing from that process. And right now we're going through a series as a church. It's called Keeping It Together. And we've been going through this series for a couple of weeks now. And one of the things that Pastor Ben said in his first teaching in this series is he had said that the things that kind of keep us together is determined by how we answer conflict. And in order to answer conflict, we have to answer our calendar. But in order to answer our calendar, we have to create sacred. And to create sacred, we need to first create solid. And so last week we talked about what it means to create solid relationships in our life. And today I want to talk to you about what it means to create sacred time, sacred space, sacred relationships in your life. And to be more specific about what it means to create sacred, what I'm talking about is those relationships, that time that never seems to budge in your life. They are the concrete things that you look to that kind of hold things together. And what I want to encourage you today with is that we can't skip steps. I think a lot of people, they hear the message that we heard last week on creating these solid relationships, and they want to jump immediately into action. Okay, now I want to start answering my calendar. I want to start answering the conflict. And they miss this step of creating sacred. And there's an interesting encounter that happens in the Bible with Jesus. We find it in Luke 11, and we're going to start at at verse 38, and we're going to jump around a little bit here, but this interaction, I think, speaks a lot to this idea of creating sacred and its importance. So we start off at Luke 11:38. Just to give you some context, Jesus has been invited over to a Pharisee's house, and he's going to have dinner with the Pharisees. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the Pharisees were like this group of people that were very religious. They were very much about rules and action and doing things. And these Pharisees are often fighting against Jesus. And so it's very interesting that Jesus actually goes over to one of their homes to have dinner. But the interesting thing is that he has not washed his hands beforehand before eating this meal, and we will see what happens here. But the Pharisee was surprised when he noticed that Jesus did not first wash before the meal. Now, I do want to make a note here, and it's important to remember that this doesn't necessarily mean that Jesus was being rude and that he hadn't actually, cleaned his hands. What they're talking about here is a ceremonial washing. Like, he wasn't ceremonially clean. He was probably clean enough to eat at your house and my house, but he wasn't ritually clean. And so that's what's upsetting the Pharisee here. Then the Lord said to him, "Now then, you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. You foolish people, did not the one who made the outside make the inside also? But now, as for what is inside you, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you give God a tenth of your mint, rue, and all of the other kinds of garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. You should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone." And then all of a sudden there's somebody else in the mix. There's this expert in the law, and he pipes up. He says, "One of the experts in the law answered him, 'Teacher, when you say these things, you insult us also.' Jesus replied, 'And you?'" It's almost as if Jesus was just waiting for him to pipe up, because he's like, this is really directed at you as well. "And you, experts in the law, woe to you, because you load people down with burdens they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not lift one finger to help them. Woe to you, experts in the law, because you have taken away the key to knowledge. You yourselves have not entered, and you have hindered those who were entering." This is such an interesting interaction, because what Jesus is pointing out here is he's talking to these Pharisees and the experts in the law, and he's pointing out, he says, you guys are really good at following rules. You guys are really good about implementing action, but you've skipped a step. He said there's something missing from the way that you act out your faith. And we can find that in that last bit of scripture there where he says, you have taken away the key to knowledge. You have taken it away. There's something missing. You gotta think of this almost like building a home. There's a process to living out our faith. There's a process to, even within this series, kind of keeping it together. There's a process, and you can't skip steps. So let's think about it this way. Last week we talked about creating solid. And if you want to look at that on more of a bigger scale within our faith, that's like creating the beliefs. That's building our foundation, if we were to talk about it in a sense of building a home. And so today what I want to talk about is creating sacred time, sacred relationships. And if you look at that on a bigger scale, that's creating our values, Or if you want to talk about it in terms of building a home, that's like framing up a home. And sometimes what happens is we want to skip over creating sacred. We want to skip over having these values. We want to skip over framing a home, and we want to jump to answering the calendar, answering conflict. We want to jump into actions and rules. It's kind of like, if we're to talk about this in terms of building a home, it's kind of like building a foundation and then jumping into carpeting your living room or trying to tile your kitchen afterwards, but you have no frame. There's nothing there to build upon. So I don't want anybody to get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that these aren't important. And in fact, Jesus wasn't trying to say that either. He said you should be doing both of these things. He says there's just something missing. I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't look to answer conflict and you shouldn't look to answer your calendar. I'm just saying it's important that we don't skip this step of creating sacred, creating values, having our house framed up. So studies have actually shown that teaching values before rules is actually extremely effective. And one particular study studied this neighborhood that during the Holocaust, there were people within this neighborhood that they were non-Jewish people, and they hid Jews during the Holocaust. And there were other non-Jewish people that chose not to hide Jewish people during the Holocaust. And so what they did was they interviewed those that rescued and those that didn't rescue, and they found something very interesting. They found quite a few interesting things, but one of the points that they found was that those that chose to rescue, when they were disciplined as children, they weren't just told, you're breaking a rule, you need to be punished. Instead, what they were told was, you're breaking a rule, you need to know why this rule is in place. You need to know why this rule is important. And so they were taught from a very early age why values are so important, because values actually inform the rules. Values are the thing that doesn't get shifted. Values are the thing that we can identify with. And so another study showed that children are actually less likely to cheat if they're told, don't be a cheater, over don't cheat. And this study also showed that teenagers were less likely to drive drunk if they were told, don't be a drunk driver, over don't drink and drive. See, one addresses the value, one addresses the identity, and one skips over the value and identity, and it just goes straight to the rules, and it's not effective. And this is because, like those people that rescued Jews during the Holocaust, they understood that rules sometimes had to be shifted. Sometimes the rules didn't line up with the value. I want to tell you about a particular youth that I had when I was working with a group of teens in Cambridge. And this particular youth, he actually ended up becoming my brother-in-law. But this particular youth always found a way around the rules that we had for games that we were playing. And he would always find some way to follow the rules, and yet it still felt like it was cheating. It still felt like it was doing something to the game that we didn't want it to happen as leaders. And so one kind of instance of this was we had created this really cool version of dodgeball where we kind of said that dodgeball sometimes, because people are getting eliminated, it doesn't keep enough people in the game, And so we wanted to find a way to keep people in the game longer. And so we found that like if you add a rule that says, oh, if you catch the ball, your entire team gets to come back in. And that way, everybody gets to keep playing. But the problem is then the game goes on too long. So we decided we would add another rule where there were pins along the backside of your side of the court, and you could win one of two ways. You could eliminate the other team completely, or you could knock over all of their pins. Once a pin had been knocked over, you couldn't put it back up. And in order to keep the game a little less violent, we always said you had to hit people from waist down in order to get them out. That just kind of prevented some headshots. And what my brother-in-law found was that if he contorted himself enough around the pin on his side, he could protect it using only his torso. So people would be throwing balls, and they wouldn't be able to get him out, and they wouldn't be able to knock the pin over, but he wasn't attempting to catch the ball. The game was falling apart. The game was missing the value that it set out to have. And so we had to always adjust the rules to our games, and these were always called the Jared clause. We always had to have a change of rules after we had started playing a new game because sometimes those rules need to be adjusted. And you're going to find this as you live out your Christian faith. It's not just about setting up all these rules and regulations. Sometimes those rules are going to have to be adjusted based on the things that you value, the things that are sacred. And so when we talk about creating sacred time, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about going back to what is the heart of what's going on here and how do we maintain that. And so when I think about creating sacred in my life, I think about the fact that I value my wife. I value my time with her. And so when we set up a date night, that date night doesn't move. Everything else around can get shifted, but that's going to be the thing that stays in place. I think about my kids and how important they are to me and that my time with them is valuable. And so when I've got time scheduled to do something with them, that doesn't move. And I think about my relationship with God. And I think about how that is an important relationship in my life, and therefore I make time to spend with God, whether that be coming out to church, that be time spent in devotions, that be time spent in life group. These are the things that don't move because they are valuable. And one of the interesting things that you can do here is if you're sitting here and you're going, well, I don't know what things I actually value right now. You can actually take a look at your calendar. You can take a look at the things in your life, and you can ask the question of, well, what are the things that don't move for me? And you'll quickly find out what things in your life you actually value. What are the things in your life that you never seem to budge on? You're going to see that maybe sometimes work actually is the thing that doesn't seem to move, and date night gets shifted. Or you're going to see that sometimes hockey takes precedent over church. And that's the thing that doesn't actually move. You're going to see that maybe for parents out there, that your child's education is actually more important to you than their relationship with God, because if they have homework, they're not coming out to youth. And we need to start asking ourselves the questions about what do we value and how does that affect what we consider to be sacred. And I think for a lot of us, it can be scary what we discover. It can be scary to look at our calendar and see that hockey's always winning, education's always winning. And I'm not trying to say that these things are bad, but there's often times that we neglect our relationship with God. We neglect our relationship with our family. So maybe you're here today and you find yourself frustrated. You find yourself going, I want to create this sacred time. I want to have this time in my calendar. I want to have these sacred relationships that never seem to budge, these things that are kind of like the solid foundation and framework that I need to start, building these actions on. But you don't know where to start. And I want to tell you once again today that it's so important that we don't skip steps. It's not just about putting it in your calendar and saying, this is sacred. You can't just say that this relationship is sacred and all of a sudden it will become that. What I'm trying to say today is that it has to be something that you value. It has to be something that is embedded, that is stitched into, that you identify with deep down in your heart. Otherwise, it's just going to be another action. It's just going to be another thing that can get moved. And the only thing that I've really discovered in my life that is a solution to this is my relationship with Jesus. See, the answer to finding values and sacred time is in Jesus. The more I get to know Jesus, the more I want to know him. And so my time with him becomes more valuable and sacred. And the more I get to know Jesus, the more I realize he wants me to become a certain type of person. And the more I get to know Jesus, I realize that he wants me to be a better husband. And so my time with my wife becomes more valuable and sacred. He wants me to be a better husband, and so my time with my kids becomes more valuable and sacred. He wants me to be in life-giving, life-flourishing relationships, and so my time with my friends who are going to keep me accountable becomes valuable and sacred. He wants me to be a provider to my family, and so yes, even my work time becomes valuable and sacred. See, the answer to finding our values and sacred time is in Jesus. It's not in a rule. It's not in a principle. It's not in a concept. It's in a person, because we can identify with a person. We can identify with Jesus. We can take his values on as our own. And this is kind of where we bridge the gap between last week's message and this week's, and we talk about why creating that solid relationship with Jesus is so important, because it leads us to our values and our sacred time. But the troubling thing about identifying with Jesus, the troubling thing about finding our values in the things that Jesus finds his values in, is that those values led him to the cross. They led him to the cross, and those values were things that he was not willing to budge on. And if we look at places like Jesus' teaching in Matthew 5-7, it's one of Jesus' largest teaching. He's unpacking the law, and he's saying it's not just about the rules, it's about the value behind the rule. He says it's not just enough that you don't commit murder, it's that life is valuable, human life is valuable, and to demean and diminish it in any way is actually still wrong. And so he says, even if you have hatred in your heart, you've committed murder. And he says it's not just enough that you don't cheat. It's that if you've got a wandering mind and a wandering eye, it's still detrimental to your marriage. And so Jesus points these things out. He points these values out, and it's these values that send him to the cross. But it's on the cross that we see something incredible. We see how powerful these values actually are. Because it's on the cross where Jesus cries out, "Father, forgive these people, for they know not what they do." And this is so important because the cross was designed not just as an instrument for killing someone, not just a painful death. The cross was meant to be a place where people like Jesus, who had these values, who had these ideas that were world-changing ideas, it was a place where those things were supposed to be shut down. It was a place that was meant to completely break your spirit. It was a place that was meant to completely break your values, to have it all fall apart, and so that your movement would be stopped where it was, it would not continue, and the Roman government could continue doing whatever it was that they wanted to do. But on the cross, we see that Jesus doesn't break. If we go back to that value that he taught, that human life is important, and that you're not even supposed to have hatred in your heart towards someone. And he says that needs to go even beyond loving the people that love you. He says it's supposed to go all the way to loving your enemy. And on the cross, we see a place where Jesus is supposed to be broken, and he doesn't break. And he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." We see on the cross that Jesus maintains his value. He maintains the value of this human life. And we see that the cross doesn't break him, and death doesn't even break him. And when I see this, I go, those are the kind of values that I want to have in my life. That is the person that I want to identify with most. So what's the secret? What's the secret to creating sacred, to having these values, to forming them in your life? It's Jesus. Get to know Jesus. Lean on Jesus. I know that this seems like a very broad answer to give you, but I promise you, it's because it's difficult. And creating these values, creating this sacred time is a difficult thing to do, but it's a step that can't be skipped. Otherwise, we're just living in an apartment waiting for the closet door to explode with all of the garbage that we've been trying to hide. And so I want to encourage you today, lean on Jesus. And I promise you, you will find those values. And so I'm just going to pray. Lord God, I thank you so much for Jesus. I thank you so much that we have a person that we can identify with, a person that we can follow our values with. We have someone that we can identify with and that we can start building our life around. God, that there is someone who can teach us about what is meant to be sacred, what is meant to be valuable. And I pray, God, that we would have the strength to make these things valuable and sacred in our life. That it wouldn't just be about creating rules around them, but that, God, they would become embedded in our heart. And it's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.